QuickBooks Online 2021, Other section, Forms and Functions. Let's get into it with Intuit's QuickBooks Online 2021. Here we are on the Google search page. We're searching for QuickBooks Online Test Drive. Then we'll select QuickBooks Online Test Drive Intuit. Now, I do happen to be a robot, but I'm with a non-robot friend, and I find that Intuit still usually lets you in as long as you're with a non-robot friend, especially if it's an attractive non-robot friend. So let's check it out and try it out. And there we have it, no problem. We're in the Craig's Design and Landscaping Services practice file. Once you're inside, Intuit doesn't typically bother you once you're inside here. So in prior presentations, we're going to the plus drop down here. We've been looking at the items in the customer section, the vendor section. We'll take a look at the employees section in future presentations. Now we want to consider some of these other items here. Now, when you think about these groupings, notice what we're talking about with the groups is typically how we want to visualize the flow of transactions, meaning the customers are going to be like the sales cycle, the accounts receivable cycle, vendors being like the payable cycle, the expenses cycle, and then the employees, obviously the payroll cycle. And then you have these other items. Why are they here in this section? Well, they don't fit in any of the cycles completely, and therefore QuickBooks put them in the other section. However, they are important enough, they happen often enough, that QuickBooks wants to put them in this main dropdown that we're using most of the time. So these are things that QuickBooks obviously feels are important, so we want to go over these other items as well. Now, I just want to compare this to the desktop version just so we can see the layout in the flowchart as well. So we looked at the flowchart in terms of the vendor section, most of the items in the vendor section, the customer section or sales cycle, most of the items here. We'll look at the employee section later. Now we're kind of, if you're looking at it in terms of the homepage type of layout, we have like these items over here in the company section and the banking section. Again, QuickBooks seeing them as important, things that we're going to use fairly often, things that you should be using, but they're not directly in a flow, or they may be in multiple different flows, and therefore they have their separate kind of place over in a separate section. So let's go back on over and let's just check out a couple of these and just say a little bit about them. We've got the bank deposit first. Now, we took a look at the bank deposit form when we were considering the customer section over here, because we're hoping most of the bank deposits, the money going into the checking account, is coming from customers. But the reason we can't put it really under the customer section, or why it might not be completely proper to do so, is that although most of the deposits are from customers, hopefully, we might have other deposits, such as, for example, the owner putting money into the bank, or we might take a loan or something like that and put money into the bank and have a deposit in that way. So that's why the deposit's kind of over here in other, but obviously it's going to be a very important form, because every time you have an increase to the checking account, it'll typically be, a deposit will be the most common form. Now, a transfer, we could have a transfer from one account to another. So again, that's not something that we're going to normally do, and a transfer is less likely to be something from a customer, and therefore we have it over here in the other section as well. The journal entry. Now, if you're an accounting student, if you've learned like accounting in a classroom, and then you move to accounting software, you have a tendency to want to see everything many people have a tendency to want to see everything in terms of journal entries. I want to see the debits and credits that are going to be involved, and you'll typically start to say, I want to not use these forms over here that are driving the actual transactions, that are recording the journal entries, but rather just enter the journal entry directly. But notice QuickBooks is designed not to do that so much. QuickBooks is designed to set up the system so that you can then assign the information to other people, and you can delegate responsibility that way and different tasks to different people by making the data input forms as straightforward as possible. So really, the journal entry is the last thing you want to do. QuickBooks almost wants to hide it. QuickBooks basically wants to say, hey, don't enter journal entries unless you cannot fit it into the system. So that means if you're talking about a transaction that's not in the normal customer cycle, that's not in the normal vendor cycle, that's not in the normal employee or payroll cycle, then you default maybe to the journal entry, because all of these forms that are in these other cycles are basically creating a journal entry, but they're doing it within the structure of QuickBooks. Now, we will use journal entries when we go to the adjusting entries. And again, if you have some kind of transaction that doesn't fit in the normal process, then you might use a journal entry. For example, if you purchased equipment or something like that, it's not, and you purchased it for a loan, let's say, then that doesn't fall into the normal categories over here. the adjusting journal entries don't fall into the normal categories. And so we have to go outside the normal box, the normal routine. And then we have the statement, we have the inventory quantity adjustment, which would only be applicable if you have and are tracking inventory and need to make adjustments to it. The pay down credit card, we might get more into basically managing the credit cards in the future presentations or in future sections as well. And then I'm going to go back over to the home page on the desktop version just to see the items that are included there that QuickBooks kind of thinks are important. So in the company section over here, we also have the chart of accounts. Now, the chart of accounts is going to be really, really important, and many people will see them as lists or categorized under the category of lists because they happen to be in this dropdown. It's not really an accounting term, so there's the chart of accounts, there's the item list. These are the two primary things that if you're a QuickBooks user and you've used the desktop version for a long time, you may classify under the term lists because it happened to fall into that dropdown, even though lists is not like a formal accounting term, but you'll probably hear it in the online version. They kind of brought it over in the online version, even though you don't have the same drop down. But we'll talk more about the chart of accounts later. The reason it's not in one of these flows here is because these flows, all of these forms, will be affecting the chart of accounts, but the chart of accounts is something that you're going to have to set up before you make any of the forms. It's kind of the first thing that you're going to set up. So if you're using the QuickBooks file that has already been set up, the chart of accounts is already good to go, and you don't need to do much with it unless you need to go make adjustments to which accounts you're going to be affecting. So we'll get into making the chart of accounts a lot more when we start a new company file, but we'll review it more in detail. But that's going to be obviously a really important thing because it underlines, the creation of the financial statements, which is our end product, the balance sheet, and the income statement or profit and loss. Then we have the items and services. We looked at those briefly. Those are the things we sell. Those are going to be the inventory items and the service items. Once again, they're not in this flow item here because they could be things that you're purchasing in inventory with purchase order. They could also affect the sales cycle when you make an invoice or sales receipt as well. And we set them up when we made invoices and sales receipt. We set up a quick items over here. These are things, once again, that if you're going into a company file that's already set up, then typically they'll have those items set up, and all you have to do is kind of use the items. But it's really useful to set up the items or start a company file from scratch, as we will do in the second part of the course, because then you really get to understand, what needed to go into the process so that the data input could be as easy as possible. And part of that is this key thing, the items. Once set up, however, then they should be good to go, and you can run your accounting system, you can delegate duties, people can do the data input forms, and they don't really need to know the behind the scenes items or the behind the scenes, chart of account type of things. And then we've got the ordering checks. So if you need to order checks, that's usually kind of an add-on thing. It's almost a sales type of thing because might purchase checks. And then we have the calendar. So we could set up transactions to be renewed transactions or memorized transactions. So we might talk about that later, and you could start to, record transactions and whatnot and list when certain things need to happen, and QuickBooks can kind of give you reminders of that. And then down here we have the Reconcile. Now the bank reconciliation is going to be a huge thing as well, and that's something that happens periodically. So these things up top are things that happen, every day oftentimes. These things are happening every day in an active type of company, or, payroll happens periodically, but happens possibly a couple times a month. Whereas the Reconcile, primarily thinking about bank reconciliations, happens monthly. But it's a huge internal control, and therefore, they see it as important enough to put here. We will do bank reconciliations as well. You really want to reconcile the bank accounts. You should do it whether you use bank feeds or not, because it's still a good double check. We'll talk more about that when we get to the bank feeds, as how it fits into the bank feeds. But that's going to be an important item as well. And then we have the check register. Now the check register happens to be the register, basically looking at the checking account from a register standpoint. And we looked at that a couple times when we entered an invoice and when we entered, not an invoice, but entered some deposits and checks directly into the checking account. So for many times when you're doing transactions with cash, if you don't need to use one of these forms to enter it, you might just go directly to the register. So some of those items are also found in the cog up top, and we'll go over them more in the future. So you have your company information over here, your company, And then in this lists item, you see that terminology that they still kind of use for the lists. So here's all the lists. The list includes the products and services. Those are the item lists in the desktop version. Reoccurring transactions. So we can set those reoccurring transactions, and it'll help us to basically set those transactions attachments. If you then go into all the lists, then it's going to give you all the lists. So if you're used to that terminology of lists, here's where you can go to get to your chart of accounts. It's not the only place to go to get there, but chart of accounts, recurrent transactions, products and services, and custom forms, and so on and so forth. You can also get to that chart of accounts down here, as we saw in prior presentations in the accounting. You have chart of accounts and Reconcile. So if I go into the accounting tab on the left-hand side, I'm going to say I want to see the chart of accounts. Then this is where you can go to see that chart of accounts. This is also where you can go to get to that check register. So remember, the check register is right here. Any balance sheet account will have a register. The cash register, the register related to the checking account, however, is the one that's most commonly used. So you can go into that check register and see the increases and decreases to the checking account in a similar fashion as you've seen, if you have a checkbook and you're recording information into the checkbook. Notice you could see, though, an increase and decrease in all the balance sheet accounts in a similar fashion. So we can enter transactions in that way, which can be useful. And we can basically enter journal entries in like a register format, which can be interesting and useful as well. We don't have the register on the income statement accounts you'll see down below. So it's something that will be applied to the balance sheet accounts. Then on the Reconcile tab, this is where we go for that bank reconciliation. So if we wanted to reconcile, we're going to get started maybe later, and then this is where we looked at that reconciliation process, and we'll go into the reconciliation process at a future point, but you really want to do that on a monthly basis so that it's a good verification or double check of the books.